lo hanno chiamato di un paese lontano. Lontano ma sempre così vicino per la comunione nella fede e nella tradizione cristiana. Anche non so se potrei bene spiegarmi nella la nostra lingua italiana. Se mi sbaglio, mi corrigerete.
Speaking to André Froissart, the French writer who perhaps knows John Paul II better than anyone else, the Pope declared, "When I said in Rome on the day of my election that I come from afar, I was thinking of Peter, the son of Israel, a Galilean. He too came from afar." Then again, referring to the power of suffering, he added, "On that 16th of October, when I was asked to accept, in the course of an afternoon, the plan that God was revealing to me through the voice of the cardinals, I am certain that I received help from all those who complete in their flesh that which is lacking in the passion of Christ." The charisma of Peter, to whom he is the 264th successor, and the seal of suffering, a suffering that he experienced together with the Polish people, first personally and then as head of the church. These are the two fundamental aspects of a highly dynamic and innovative pontificate, which up until 1991 was marked by more than 50 trips abroad, more than 100 trips inside Italy, hundreds of visits to parishes within the Diocese of Rome, the great catechesis at the Wednesday public audiences, a dozen encyclicals, and many other letters and magisterial documents. A dynamic and innovative pontificate compelled by a sense of duty to see the Second Vatican Council realized in the entire Church as he had already seen it realized in the Church in Krakow. During his 20 years of episcopal service there, his many visits to parishes were in some way pilgrimages to the sanctuary of God's people. Visits which, thanks to the presence of the bishop, reunited and reincorporated the Christian community of Krakow into the full dimension of the Church. From the beginning, this is how he wanted to practice the ministry of Peter. The more difficult man's life becomes, the more John Paul II feels the need and the obligation to go on pilgrimage to the sanctuary of God's people. The people of God are this sanctuary, he explains to Froissart, the people who participate in the royal priesthood of Christ. And every man is this sanctuary, whose mystery is neither fully explained nor fully revealed in any other way than in the mystery of the Word made flesh. Thus, one begins to understand the Pope's constant quest to meet man. Armed solely with the strength of the gospel, John Paul meets him, whether in the most hidden corner of Africa, in a parish on the outskirts of Rome, or in the library of the papal palace. Man, he writes in his first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, is the only creature which God has desired for himself. Man, the way of the Church, man created in God's image and likeness, redeemed by Christ, and for this very reason, possessing dignity such as must be defended to the end, even unto death. It is not surprising, then, that in a very short time, John Paul II became known as the Pope for Human Rights. And it is true that he constantly reminds us of these rights, not only in Rome, but in every country that has opened its doors to him, sometimes at the risk of being accused of shaking hands with dictators and the powerful, and even before governments which are definitely not above reproach. Thus people have come to expect John Paul to assert their rights and justice on every occasion, rights and justice which in fact need definition today more than ever before. André Froissart, the French journalist and academic, whose many books include Do Not Be Afraid and The World According to John Paul II, is the most authentic and authoritative commentator on the Pope. Let us review with Monsieur Froissart the itinerary of this pontificate, from the day of John Paul's election to those epoch-making events for which the first Slav Pope in history had, by his very election, prepared the way and predisposed the world.
Un papa straniero dopo 450 anni e per di più
A foreign pope after 456 years and what's more a Slav. Now, how did this event of October 16, 1978 strike you? First of all, we were naturally surprised, and to such an extent that even some of the Poles thought an African pope had been elected due to the strange pronunciation of the name Wojtyła. There were astonished reactions all around, considerable amazement, and the atmosphere in St. Peter's Square was fantastic. Everyone was crying and nobody knew why. If one considers today the election in 1978 of a pope from behind the Iron Curtain, at a time when nobody imagined that communism, or rather the totalitarian system, was approaching its end, one would say it was prophetic.
Alors que personne ne pouvait savoir que le communisme, enfin le système totalitaire, était près de sa fin, c'est une élection prophétique. Enfin, c'est la rupture avec la tradition.
The break with the tradition of Italian popes was already an extraordinary event. But to go and choose a pope from the domain of what, at that time, was still the Red Church was a phenomenon, especially when one thinks of the good cardinals who made this choice. It is amazing.
C'est étonnant. C'était un grand moment.
It was a great moment. And seeing John Paul II for the first time in St. Peter's Square, all dressed in white, with his crucifix grasped in both hands like a sword, was truly astonishing.
Il Papa dei diritti dell'uomo è stato subito evidente che
The Pope for Human Rights. It was immediately evident that this Pope was a defender of man, of his dignity and fundamental rights. Even his first encyclical is directed toward this. Now, what do you think of his defense of human dignity, placing man at the focal point of everything?
Dell'interesse di tutto.
First, it is natural for the son of what was a divided, separated, and oppressed country, a country that had suffered two occupations simultaneously and two totalitarian regimes, both of which detested the human person, one prompted by racism and the other for more complex ideological reasons. The results of both, however, were identical. The human person did not count. It was logical, then, that a pope coming from this part of the world could not fail to defend the rights of the wounded and humiliated, precisely because he had experienced these sufferings in his own flesh right from his childhood. Consequently, it was normal that he commit himself to human rights. But what he has managed to achieve is extraordinary. Namely, that it is the Catholic Church which defends the rights of man.
Par son intermédiaire, que ce soit l'Église catholique qui défende les droits de l'homme, vous savez, c'est un événement incroyable. On aurait dit ça il y a 50 ou 60 ans.
This is an incredible event. If this had been said to political men 50 or 60 years ago, they would have laughed, because at that time the Church was considered hostile to human rights. But today, if a universal referendum were held to determine the greatest defender of human rights, the Pope would get 2 billion votes without a shadow of a doubt. It is stupendous. It is one of the great services that the Pope will have rendered to the Church, precisely because he is rightly considered to be the defender of human rights. Another service he has rendered is that of stitching together again the Christian fabric, thread by thread, by meeting the people personally, by direct contact and not through intermediaries. A third service was his reproposing a serious and profound doctrine.
profond.
Fin dalla prima enciclica, la Redemptor Hominis,
From the very first words of the Pope's first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, in which he writes, Christ is the center of the cosmos and of history, it was clear that he was committed to reproposing the message of the Second Vatican Council in his documents and to taking it around the world.
il Concilio Vaticano II nei suoi vari documenti, e portarlo in giro per il mondo.
Oui. Alors, on tient
Yes, this is precisely the essence of his way of life and thinking. History, for him, is the history of man redeemed by Christ and by the cross of Christ.
des hommes sauvés par le Christ et par la
He is bound to the cross of Christ. But this gives him a global view of the world and of history, past and future, from its beginning to its end.
et de l'histoire, une vision globale, c'est-à-dire depuis les origines jusqu'aux accomplissements futurs. Nous, journalistes ou nous, écrivains, ou nous,
We journalists, writers, common
nous
followers,
voyons l'histoire
see history in successive stages, and it never fails to
et nous
surprise
savons
us.
toujours pas lui,
Not him,
parce que
because he has a
vision
global view.
globale.
This is one of his surprising features, and it makes him one of a kind. Perhaps this is the basis of his temperament, a way of approaching life that surprises those from the West. I, too, am a little surprised by his view of life, and I once asked him how he could reconcile the history of salvation, that is, a divine history, with the history of man, which is so full of din and fury, of bloodshed and massacres and all kinds of atrocities. He replied that the history of man is a secondary history that does not prevent the accomplishment of the first.
Un papa itinerante, un pontificato itinerante.
An itinerant
Il
pope,
primo viaggio
an
nel
itinerant
79
pontificate.
in Messico e poi
John Paul II made his first trip to Mexico in 1979, followed by many trips abroad, more than 50 to date, and almost 100 trips inside Italy, to take the gospel around the world and to re-Christianize it. This considerable traveling has earned him some criticism.
Oui, mais s'il restait à Rome, on le critiquerait quand même. On dirait, ah, il bouge pas.
Even if he were to remain in Rome, he would still be criticized. They would say that he never moves because he is too comfortable surrounded by his Swiss
Si
guards.
on compare
No, he has to do what he
les
does.
Saint Paul,
If one compares the Pope's travels to those of St. Paul,
voyagé le plus.
who traveled the most? St. Paul, because he did not have the airplane.
Le peuple le fait en avion,
The routes that the Pope has taken by airplane,
en barque,
poor St. Paul traversed in a raft, a boat, which sank 3
ont
times.
coulé 3 fois.
Yet he never stopped traveling.
Voyager.
Furthermore, just as the founders of Christianity have always traveled extensively, so does the Pope,
Voyager.
who believes in everything he says. That is his nature.
Comme il croit tout ce qu'il dit.
And when he says, speaking not in 2 or 3 languages, but only one, that every human being is nothing other than a tabernacle of Jesus Christ, he believes it.
Tabernacle de Jésus-Christ, il le
And if there were
croit.
only one human being in Patagonia or in Tierra del Fuego,
Patagonie, sur la terre
he would
de
go
feu,
to
il
Patagonia or to Tierra del Fuego.
Il
He
va
would go to
voir
meet him,
le salut
to
et
greet him as the tabernacle of
le
Jesus Christ.
de Jésus-Christ.
The Pope's meetings with crowds, apart from the typical images immortalized by the mass media, remain memorable especially for those whom the Pope visits. Or rather, to truly understand the meaning and value of these trips, one has to put oneself in the place of those who wait for him and welcome him. Catholics, non-Catholics, and non-Christians alike wait, because John Paul II is, if nothing else, that great moral authority who defends the fundamental rights of all. Perhaps the most stirring of these meetings, outside of the famous meetings with young people from every continent, are those between John Paul II and workers. From Monterrey in Mexico to Nowa Huta in Poland, from Saint-Denis in France to the annual meeting of March 19th in Italy, John Paul II has always had a special rapport and dialogue with workers. The Pope's personal friendship, respect, and affection for Lech Walesa, the electrician from Danzig who 10 years later became the president of Poland, and for the men from Solidarność, mirrors the special esteem he has for labor and the value of work. He has even dedicated 3 of his encyclicals to these subjects. It should not be forgotten that it was the workers themselves, the working class, who were the first to undermine the ideology that instead of investing them with privileges, had trampled on their most basic rights. Among the most important of his first meetings was one in Saint-Denis, in the northern outskirts of Paris, the so-called Red Belt, the most communist outskirts of France. Nevertheless, the people of Saint-Denis said, "If the Pope comes to visit us, it means that we too are somebody." The meeting took place outside the Gothic abbey in which the kings of France are buried.
Et alors que se déroulait la cérémonie,
While the ceremony, organized by the heads of the church, was taking place, the people of Saint-Denis and the surrounding area had converged, little by little, to form an immense assembly with which the Pope had an especially moving and unexpected encounter. This is an exquisite memory of his trip.
Particulièrement émouvant et profond. Et c'était en effet, comme vous l'avez dit, tout à fait inattendu. Et ça, c'est un très bon souvenir.
He makes direct contact with the people,
le contact direct
less with the intellectuals and intermediaries, more with the simple people with whom contact is immediate and easier.
Intermédiaire, mais avec les populations, les gens simples, ça marche toujours très bien. Il est en contact immédiat.
He himself had been a worker for 4 years at the Solvay, where he experienced daily the manual labor of the workman in a stone quarry.
D'ailleurs, il a l'expérience du travail manuel, du travail quotidien de l'ouvrier. Ça l'aide.
This experience has helped him understand the condition of the worker very well, and should also help intellectuals understand the Pope better, because sometimes they do not understand him at all.
Il Papa e la pace. Durante la guerra
The
del
Pope
Golfo
in
ci sono
peace.
stati-
During the Gulf War, the reasons for the Pope's position were misunderstood by observers and
Dagli
journalists.
osservatori, dai giornalisti.
Oui, parce que
That's true.
il y a une chose qu'on n'a pas
There is something that was not understood very well.
c'est qu'il a
At a certain
craint,
point, the Pope feared
à un moment
that the
donné,
intervention
que
of Western
dans les
forces would be
populations
interpreted by the
arabes
Arab
et
and Muslim
musulmanes,
populations as a new
l'intervention
crusade.
occidentale soit considérée.
He wanted to avoid Christian-Muslim antagonism. He made 53 interventions, I believe. Furthermore, he's a man of peace. He probably thought that the veto and the embargo would have been sufficient and that it would not be necessary to resort to arms.
Quelquefois, il attribue
It was
à la
reasonable to think so. The Pope is not an absolute pacifist. He is pacific.
Par exemple,
He does, however, prefer nonviolence to violence.
il dit
He attributes some of the successes which he has achieved, for example, in Poland, to nonviolence.
que
He says in his third encyclical, Centesimus Annus, that every time the Poles have found a nonviolent response, the result has been a capitulation of power.
il oublie ça.
Here he humbly forgets to mention the essential element, which is he himself.
La Polonia ha avuto il primo ministro.
In its post-war
nella
history,
storia di
Poland was the
questo
first
dopoguerra
communist country to have a Catholic prime minister, Mazowiecki. All the countries of the East followed Poland's example until the Soviet Communist Party finally fell on August 19, 1991.
sovietico il 19 di agosto.
What role did the Pope play in all of this?
Quale ruolo ha giocato il Papa in tutta questa vicenda?
Écoutez, de toute façon, cet effondrement
There is something inexplicable about the defeat of totalitarianism as an active and powerful ideology. More than just communism. The defeat of both appears to be without cause. Objectively, one could reason that the end of the system, which was completely unexpected by the majority of observers, practically nobody had even imagined it, was due to a long internal deterioration of which we Westerners were not aware. Another factor was the arrival of Gorbachev, who felt that things had to change if Russians were ever to reach a standard of living comparable to that of North Americans.
L'arrivée de Gorbatchev, qui a senti qu'il était nécessaire de changer les choses si les Russes voulaient rattraper vraiment l'Amérique du Nord et pas l'Amérique du Sud.
Then there was the Pope. The meeting of the two on spiritual grounds was surprising and at the same time crucial. These three factors acted together.
A accentué autant que possible, tant qu'il a pu, disons qu'il a soutenu énergiquement, avec beaucoup d'adresse, mais d'obstination.
For his part, the Pope cautiously but tenaciously and persistently supported Solidarność, the anti-government movement against the oppressor, namely the Communist Party.
Symbolisé par le Parti communiste. Il l'a soutenu, non seulement
he supported this movement not only at the beginning, but also when he visited Poland in the depths of crisis.
Moralement, jusqu'au dernier millimètre. Et
on that occasion, he morally occupied the territory to the last millimeter. The evolution of Poland accelerated that of Hungary, which had only just begun. Hungary half opened the Iron Curtain in the direction of Austria. The poor East Germans passed through Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Austria to re-enter Germany. It was a sort of movement, a fantastic exodus, that involved the eastern countries in Germany and compelled the communist regime in Moscow either to react by force, though it didn't have the means to do so, or to watch Yalta, and any possibility of keeping it intact die.
Que le système de Yalta était mort, c'était fini, qu'on ne pouvait plus le maintenir intact.
Lei ha conosciuto molto bene Giovanni Paolo II.
You've gotten to know John Paul II particularly well while writing this book.
J'espère le voir encore souvent.
Sì. Quindi è uno di quelli che lo conosce particolarmente bene. Come uomo,
What is John Paul, the man, like?
Come l'ha conosciuto lei?
On n'en sait rien parce qu'il est exactement.
I have only met him at table for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, but never in his office. Always at table, with a cup of coffee or a glass of wine. I have never met him in any other circumstances. Thus, I have met him on familiar terms, also because only his secretaries and my wife, who accompanies me, were present.
Familière, parce qu'il n'y a jamais non plus d'autres personnes que nous. Nous sommes seuls avec les secrétaires et ma femme qui vient maintenant régulièrement.
I have noted that there is just one single John Paul II. He is the same person at table as he is in St. Peter's Square.
Vous le voyez à 40 mètres ou à 1,25 m de l'autre côté de la nappe.
Seeing him from a distance of 40 meters or from a distance of 1 meter. At the other end of the table, he is always the same man. He does not have a separate public and private image. He is completely and integrally one with his office. It is this very unity between what he is, says, thinks, and believes that gives him this radiant force. There is no difference between what he is, says, thinks, and believes. It is all one. He has an exceptional inner unity, but he has no private life. Once a year he goes to the Dolomites for 2 days, or to the Vallée d'Aosta to ski a little downhill, as a result of which the priests in the Vallée d'Aosta no longer say, "The Lord be with you," but rather, "The Lord ski with you." This is as far as his recreation goes. Everything else is devoted to his priesthood and to the church. He does not even have an hour to himself. Not even half an hour. After lunch, he sleeps for half an hour. Then he takes up his breviary once more and begins receiving or studying documents again. He works even in the evenings on his encyclicals. It is incredible. At 5:45 in the morning, as soon as he wakes up, he begins to pray and meditate. Throughout the day, he does not have a minute to himself. He is a little more relaxed at Castel Gandolfo, but that does not mean to say he has a private life. He simply doesn't. Unity of life, then, and total commitment to his ministry. A commitment which occasionally raises objections and criticism that stem from certain lay prejudices on the one hand, or from the fashion of challenging authority, widespread in the areas of Catholic dissent, on the other. From his first trip to Mexico in January 1979, the Pope has been subject to attack by those who labeled him as a conservative, simply because he asserted that true freedom is first and foremost freedom from sin. These same people, a day later, praised him for taking a progressive stand when he said to the campesinos of a depressed rural zone in Mexico that there is a social mortgage on property. The fact is that the Church, as the Pope himself often says, has no social models to propose. It denounces, inspires, suggests, directs consciences, and indicates its own social doctrine, but does not impose models. The Church leaves the laity free to make their own decisions in their own field. And at the same time it denounces, as John Paul II did on his trip to Brazil in October 1991, the clericalism of those in the Church hierarchy who intervene in political events, and of those lay people who seek to impose their own Catholic way. From principles and moral values, the Pope cannot deviate. And this is precisely where he comes under attack.
Oui, bon ça, les critiques.
Yes, those who criticize him misunderstand him, and those who attack him do not know him. He is considered fairly progressive on social questions because he will not give in to totalitarianism. But he also thinks that liberalism may be a mask for totalitarianism, and therefore is to be condemned as well.
Peut-être à sa façon un totalitarisme sournois déguisé qu'il condamne aussi. Mais on lui reproche aussi d'être conservateur.
He is reproached also for conservative morality because he is against abortion and related matters. But he does not cease to repeat the gospel. His task is to spread the gospel. He never condemns anybody. He never says, if you act this way, you are committing a mortal sin. No, he merely expresses the Christian ideal. Everyone tries to reach him as far as they are able, and he has the greatest understanding, friendship, and sympathy for those who do not manage to do so. He never condemns anybody, but he is obliged to express what is right in some way. That is all. He cannot do otherwise. He is the Pope. He is not the legislator of a democracy. He cannot reform or modify the law, nor can he weaken it, even if sometimes he does so. He lightens the requirements of the gospel when he can, but he cannot allow it to pass unnoticed.